This is a continuation of the reading of the book by Richard Hoskins called War Cycles, Peace Cycles. As this content is related to the broader scope of understanding macro and geopolitics, I felt this to be appropriate to include as part of the Interchain FM podcast. Enjoy.
Chapter 33, Cycles of Municipal Bond Defaults. Municipal debt requires taxes. In hard times, people feel taxes to be oppressive. The combination of high taxes and big mortgage payments overwhelms a large portion of the population. They rebel. Municipalities default. The Municipal Railroad Bond. The 1830s and the 1840s was a time of tremendous expansion in America. Cities needed money for all sorts of improvements: docks, ship channels, streets, and railroads. Railroads were the big thing. If you had a railroad, you would grow. If you didn't, you wouldn't. The railroad promoters told the story to the city fathers many different ways. To get money to build a section of a railroad, the cities issued municipal bonds. These municipal bonds were cities' IOUs promising to repay the face value plus interest. First muni defaults. The great commodity inflation of the first cycle peaked with the end of the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and the end of the War of 1812 in the United States. Commodity prices started down as debts came due and bankruptcies removed money from circulation. Toward the bottom of the Depression, massive urban unemployment plus business bankruptcies caused city revenues to evaporate. Municipal bonds started defaulting. The first recorded default in the United States was Mobile, Alabama in 1839. King Cotton put her on her feet again in the 1840s. The next was Detroit, Michigan in 1841. Then Bridgeport, Connecticut defaulted a railroad bond in 1843, the first of many, many railroad bond defaults. In 1847, Little Rock, Arkansas defaulted a general purpose bond. The reason there weren't more municipal defaults in these early years was that there weren't many municipal bonds in existence. Municipal bonds were brand new inventions. They were looked upon as being highly speculative. There were a few more scattered municipal embarrassments after 1847. In 1857 came two big ones which so dislocated the northern economy that they helped bring on the war between the states. The first was Chicago, the miracle of the West, followed closely by Philadelphia. In 1857, Philadelphia was looked upon in much the same manner as today we look upon the United States government itself. Philadelphia was sound, the mistress of the new country. She had had no real problem with her finances since 1841. In 1841, the Second Bank of the United States failed, which disclosed the fact that foreigners controlled the largest block of stock of that bank. Banking troubles brought on the municipal problem in 1857. The Bank of Pennsylvania failed, and the city couldn't get its money to pay its bondholders. A short time later, several other banks, including the Girard, suspended specie payments. This trouble with the banks played havoc with businesses that had payrolls and notes due on certain dates. One newspaper reporting the scene printed the following picture, quote, "Business of all kinds was prostrated, and the people, thrown out of employment, formed idle mobs in the streets. On November 12th, 10,000 people met in Independence Square and demanded that the city give them work. A number of public undertakings were embarked upon, and thanks to these measures, the distress did not reach the proportions which had been anticipated." End quote. The following year, Philadelphia picked up payments on her indebtedness, but this early default points out the dependence of municipal debt on the banking system itself. Banking crises can produce drastic and immediate consequences. Muni default chart. In the 1870s and 1920s, there were large numbers of banking failures. The chart on the next page shows that there was also large numbers of municipal failures occurring at the same time. The chart also shows a flurry of municipal defaults between 1858 and 1870. These were mostly in Ohio, Wisconsin, Iowa, areas formerly belonging to Virginia or settled by Virginians. Trade from the South was cut off by the war. This severely impacted this area, causing the defaults. There were also a number of defaults for the same reason in western Pennsylvania, including Pittsburgh. Practically all were railroad bond defaults. Post-war defaults 1870 to 1890. The next wave of municipal defaults seemed to come from everywhere. Much has been made over the fact that many of them were in the South. This has been used to point out Southern fiscal irresponsibility. The Southern defense has been that the whites could not vote. Blacks had control of Southern legislatures and were instructed by their Northern banking masters to vote money into existence for anything and everything, including princely salaries, lavish parties, and to buy the homes of their former owners. This argument seems irrelevant when the facts indicate that there were almost as many municipal defaults in the North as there were in the South. It serves no useful purpose to fill column after column with hundreds of names of defaulting cities and counties. Instead, a few of the better-known defaults within this 20-year period are listed with the type of bond defaulted. The results are interesting. In many states, conditions were simply terrible. It is reported that of the 300 municipalities in Illinois, a third were in default, and that during the debtors' revolt in Missouri, 9/10 of the municipalities defaulted. In Arkansas, repudiation was almost unanimous. Nashville, first receivership. Nashville, Tennessee has the distinction of being the first municipality to be placed in receivership. This unique event took place in 1869. The city was on the verge of collapse, facing hundreds of thousands of dollars of short-term unfunded debt of 30 days or less. The town had been systematically looted by its carpetbagger coalition for years. Matters were desperate. The non-voting white taxpayers persuaded a lower equity court to appoint a receiver, thereby ridding themselves of the parasites who had been tormenting them for so long. 1896. The war phase of the third cycle started, and the fresh influx of newly borrowed money caused municipal defaults to slow. By 1910, they had declined to 3 defaults recorded in that year. Good times caused by borrowing money into existence for wars don't last. The war phase ended in 1920, and as the chart clearly shows, municipal defaults again started. Municipal defaults of 1920 to 1930. The 1920s period was excellent for the stock market. Lower commodity prices and lower wages helped companies' earnings. It was, however, a bad time for municipal bonds. There were numerous defaults, but no particularly big-name defaults. The highlight of the period was the tidal wave of defaults from Washington state. These started in 1922, and by 1926 comprised a large proportion of the totals. There were 19 reported in 1926 and 40 reported in 1927. The following short list gives an idea of the widely scattered areas in which defaults occurred: Spokane, Washington; Tacoma, Washington; Sioux City, Nebraska; Dallas, Texas; Roanoke, Virginia; Vancouver, Washington; West Palm Beach, Florida. Florida defaults. The Florida debacle started in early 1920s with a real estate crash. After that, there were 2 destructive hurricanes, 2 killing frosts which decimated the fruit crop, a string of bank failures with 56 of them belonging to a chain headquartered in Atlanta. In 1929, there were 11 more reported defaults. The flood of Florida defaults came in the 1930s and were so numerous that it seemed like fruit falling from a tree. Unknown defaults. In the first 100 years of municipal bond history, there are over 800 known defaults. It is believed that only about 1/3 to 1/5 of the defaulting municipalities have been reported. Most defaults have been recorded by the tedious method of locating litigated court cases. Usually when a municipality goes broke, it is obvious to everyone and no legal action is taken. Consequently, no record of the default is made. Technicalities leading to defaults. Technicalities of the law have been used extensively to avoid payment of bonds. Whichever side was the more politically powerful was the one that usually ended up being right legally. This was especially so during the Great Granger debt revolt in the last part of the 19th century. At that time, it became a matter of religious principle among a large part of the American population not to pay usury demands. Outrageous stratagems have sometimes been used to avoid payment. School District Number 5 of Sherman County, Nebraska refused to elect officials in order to defeat the bondholders. In the case of State and Short versus Board of Commissioners of Sherman County, it was alleged, quote, officers elected in 1874 have removed from said county, and the organization of said district, so far as possible, has been abandoned and no school has been held in said district, and that for the purpose of avoiding payments of its indebtedness, said district refuses to elect new officers, end quote. This is amusing, but it is not so amusing if you consider the terrible suffering of the taxpayers during that period. This default was another influenced by the Granger debt nullification movement. Variations of this movement appeared every time hard times return. High coupon bonds. High coupon rates determine probability of a bond's being paid. High coupon rates are acceptable only when interest rates generally are high. When interest rates decline, high coupons are then considered unjust. A large percentage of defaults seem to stem from the fact that taxpayers are reluctant to pay high coupons during periods of low interest rates. Once defaulted, many bonds were redeemed at a later date. Others were adjusted. This is done by scaling the coupon rate up or down or reducing the amount paid. Too often, municipalities simply walked away from the obligation. It is reported that before 1930, about 40% of the general obligation bonds in default were held void. On the other hand, the fact remains that most municipalities have honored their municipal obligations, sometimes at a great sacrifice to their own citizens. The flood tide of municipal defaults resulting from the Great Depression of 1929 numbers over 4,700 cases. It serves no useful purpose to go into endless lists. The lessons of history are already clear to those willing to see. The purpose of any economic research is to try to gain knowledge which may help profit and avoid loss in the future. It is with a certain confidence that we try to predict the next tidal wave of municipal defaults. These defaults will stem from hard times among debtors and will cause hard times among bondholders as money is defaulted out of existence. The following are conclusions which may be drawn. Most municipal defaults occur close to the bottom side transition year. A. 1843, B. 1896, C. 1932. The next bottom side year is expected to occur sometime between the years 1988 to 1992. The majority of future municipal bond defaults may also be expected to occur near that time. The Ceylon Syndrome. The biggest unspoken danger to municipal bond debt is the repetition of the Ceylon Syndrome. In 600 BC, Greece was impacted with the same debt problem we have in the West today. Their solution was to cancel most of the debt outstanding. Hard times cause people to turn to religion. The United States is a Christian nation. This religion of the Christians prohibits interest, just as the Mohammedan religion does. This is a compelling argument for desperate men such as today's farmers. It gains teeth when Christian ministers throw in scriptural arguments. The creditor is branded as an extortioner and usurer. The debtor is the victim who is supported by divine scripture. It may turn out that the debtors will become the hunters and the creditors the hunted. It has happened in the past. The Depression of the 1870s to 1890s gave birth to the well-publicized James Gang that preyed on creditors. They were wholeheartedly supported by the people. There was also the Granger movement to nullify debt. As a result, hundreds of municipalities defaulted. Only a dreamer can separate these events. The 1920s to 1930s brought a revival of these same phenomena. It even got certain state legislators to hold moratoriums on foreclosures and reduce taxes. In places like Texas, laws were passed saying that lenders can't foreclose and sell homes, regardless of the need for taxes to pay municipal debt. The coming hard times should see a revival of everything that has gone before, except more widespread, more violent, and more political. It is almost certain that one of our present aspiring young politicians will become a modern-day Solon who will try to please the voters and put matters straight. Preachers will again raise the banner against debt and interest just as the Arabs have done. Debt will be wiped out with the stroke of, quote, Christian pen, or the edge of a reformer's sword. Those who own someone else's IOU will be wiped out, monetarily, physically, or both. Then the whole thing will start over, as money is borrowed into existence to get us out of the coming depression and into the war phase. It is recommended that those few individuals who have not done so may find it prudent to liquidate their municipal bond holdings. A municipal bond rally in the period ahead may produce the best and perhaps the last opportunity to do so. Bottom side transition year, 1932. 1928. The United States government took action against the rising prices on Wall Street. 3% of the banks failed. Stock market marched to new highs. 1929. By this time, over 8,000 U.S. banks had failed, in spite of everything the U.S. economy had held up under it all until September. Austria's Boden Credit'Ansalt Bank got into trouble and was merged with Credit Ansalt. Credit Ansalt had been borrowing from her conquerors to pay them tribute. When her conquerors refused to lend her more money, she was forced to default. The next day, September 24th, the New York Times averages peaked, signaling that something had gone wrong. If the economists and politicians didn't know the economy had come unglued, the stock market did. The total number of dollars being borrowed into existence slowed to a trickle. Those already in existence were being paid into banks as interest faster than they could be borrowed into existence. On October 24th, the market broke 31 points. It all happened so fast, in less than a month. This is why you must go by the rules. No debt and invest in no and low debt stocks. If you are caught, you will have to make do with your existing situation. 1930. Florida was in a panic with business limited to a cash basis. 5% of the banks failed. The stock market was lower. 1931. Germany defaulted. She had borrowed from the United States to pay the US, England, France, and Italy. 7% of the banks failed. Stock market was lower. 1932. By now, 60 Florida municipalities had defaulted. 13% of the nation's banks had failed. The commodity price index bottomed out. The peace phase ended as the last drop of misery was wrung from the whimpering, bewildered world. The stock market reached the level it started in 1920, and it too started up into a super bull market.